In 1961, President Kennedy called on all Americans to rise to the challenges of the day. He knew that success depended upon the unity of efforts throughout the federal government and the nation. The Greater Boston Federal Executive Board, one of 28 across the country, fosters communication, coordination, and collaboration with federal, state, and local government agencies. This is your federal government, and I am your host, Diane LeBlanc. Hello, everyone. Today we are featuring the VA Boston healthcare system, and our focus will be on the research that is being done to support our nation's veterans. We are most fortunate to have three representatives with us today: Dr. Michael Charnes, Chief of Staff; Dr. Terrence Keene, Associate Chief of Staff for Research and Development; and Dr. J. Michael Gaziano, who is with the Million Veteran Program. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Delighted to have you all here. Dr. Charnes, I'm going to start with you. If you could share with our viewers a bit about your background, your educational background, and the various professional positions that you've held before holding your current position as Chief of Staff.
Sure. So I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I stayed on after that to do internal medicine at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Then I went out to San Francisco, where I was a neurology resident at UCSF. I stayed on there to train in research and also to stay on faculty for a total of about 8 years, and then came to VA at Boston. I started off primarily doing research. My research has been on alcohol in the nervous system, and I've been focused really on the cellular and molecular events that transpire when alcohol exposure occurs during pregnancy. During that time, I became more involved clinically with VA. I maintained my laboratory, but I eventually became Chief of Neurology at VA. And then in 2003, I became Chief of Staff.
Wow, impressive.
So my current position is Chief of Staff. I'm a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and an associate dean at Harvard Medical School, and I'm also a professor of neurology and associate dean at Boston University School of Medicine.
When do you sleep?
At night.
And so your total years with the VA here in Boston?
I'm in my 26th year.
Wow, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. So, Dr. Keene, the same sort of broad question for you, a little bit about your background.
Sure. My name is Terry Keene, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I've received my doctoral training at Binghamton University, which is the State University of New York. After that, I completed an internship at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, where I stayed on staff for about 7 or 8 years. Thereafter, I came to Boston as Chief of Psychology at VA Boston, its predecessor, prior to consolidation. Since 2004, I've been the Associate Chief of Staff for Research. I also have a sort of a part-time position directing the United States' National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, 2 divisions of which are located here at VA Boston Healthcare System. My personal research has been for some 36 years, 37 years, has been studying the impact, the psychological impact of war on the men and women who served in the various war zones, stemming back to World War II, Korea, wow, Vietnam, and more recently, people from Afghanistan, Iraq, and the global war on terror more broadly. I'm also a professor of psychiatry and psychology at Boston University. And so I'm very pleased to be here. Thanks for having us.
And thank you for that. And I think we're going to have time to sort of delve more into the research that you both are doing, that all three of you are doing, and that's going to be great. Dr. Gaziano, you're up.
Well, I'm from West Virginia, and after my undergraduate work at West Virginia University, I went to Yale for medical school, and then came to Boston and stayed. I did my residency in internal medicine at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and then a fellowship in cardiology, also at the Brigham Women's Hospital and our affiliated VA. And I've been rotating through the VA, parts of the campus since 1983 since 1987 when I came to Boston. I'm a large population epidemiologist and work in very large data sets. I've been on staff at the VA for 22 years now. I serve as the scientific director of the Massachusetts Veterans Epidemiology Research and Information Center, which we call MAVERICK. And we do large-scale randomized trials there and large population research, including the Million Veteran Program. In that program, I serve as the PI, one of 2 national PIs for the Million Veteran Program.
And what is a PI?
PI is a principal investigator.
Okay.
So we help coordinate the efforts nationally. I am also a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Excellent.
Well, clearly the VA Boston healthcare system and the research function is in good hands. Lots of experience, years of experience here at this table. Dr. Chanes, as Chief of Staff, what's your overall responsibility?
The Chief of Staff in VA is responsible for the clinical work that goes on in the hospital, but also for the educational programs and research programs. We have one of the largest research programs in the country. We have the largest number of trainees who come through every year, more than 3,000. And we're the largest recipient of VA funds in the country. So at some level, working with distinguished investigators like Dr. Keene, we have to manage all of those things across our different campuses.
So the VA has many healthcare systems across the country serving our nation's veterans. Do all of them have a research function?
They don't all have a research function. There are some smaller VAs that don't have research programs, but research has been really a central mission for VA for many, many years. And those that are fortunate enough to have a research program are able to not only work on disorders that are important for veterans, but it serves as a wonderful way to attract high-level clinical talent to provide care for veterans.
So you indicated that the VA has had a research program for many years. Since the beginning, or did we sort of pick it up at some point along the way?
I would say that if you date the onset of VA to the Civil War and the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln, that it wasn't very long after, certainly in the early 20th century, that VA became invested significantly in research, and that investment has only grown over time.
So there are so many other research entities out there. Why is it important that the VA have its own research function?
Well, I think there are a number of really good reasons. First and foremost, veterans have unique experiences. They bring back from war unique problems. VA has an investment in its research program in trying to understand the basis for those problems and designing treatments that will meet specifically the needs of veterans. That's why we have the National Centers for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder as an example. VA is very committed to not just treating the problems that arise from service, but also from really extending the boundaries of our knowledge to be able to better treat those problems in the future.
And so here in the Boston area, what are the research topics that you're now doing work on?
Very broadly, our medical center has large research programs in cognitive sciences, in behavioral disorders, substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, but we have a very large surgical research program. We have research in spinal cord injury. We have research that really spans all areas of medical science.
And where does this all take place?
It takes place at all of our campuses. So VA Boston has 3 main campuses at Brockton, West Roxbury, and Jamaica Plain, and it has 5 community-based outpatient clinics. And there is some element of research going on at all of them. We have 3 animal facilities at our main campuses. We have human research at our main campuses and at a number of our community-based outpatient clinics.
And who are your major partners?
Well, we have very strong affiliations on the medical side with Harvard Medical School, Boston University School of Medicine. We have strong affiliations with a number of prestigious schools of nursing. And we have affiliations with the teaching hospitals that are affiliated with the medical schools, which are independent research entities. So just as an example, over the years, my research program has had strong ties to Harvard Medical School, but also to Brigham and Women's Hospital, Mass General, as well as other places around the country. Research these days tends to be very large, and it's very difficult to answer certain kinds of questions that require large numbers of either data sets or patients without collaborations. And so within my own research program, and I think research programs of many of our investigators, we have collaborations across the country and across the world.
So important.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a break for a minute. Dr. Keene, if you could tell our viewers, what are your responsibilities as the Associate Chief of Staff for Research and Development?
The Associate Chief of Staff for Research is basically the Chief Administrator for all of the research programs that occur. So I work very closely with the investigators and their staff, but at the same time I work closely with the Chief of Staff for management advice and guidance, and with Washington, which often provides us information to guide the directions that the nation would like to see work take. In particular, we have, I think, as Dr. Troynes suggests, a very strong post-deployment health portfolio at VA Boston Healthcare System, which I think actually accounts for lots of our success historically. That is that we are focusing on the problems that people have following deployment to a war zone. And our group in particular, I think, has a real emphasis on the problems of women veterans, and it's a portfolio that's growing as the number of women participating in the military is growing. And we have a very skilled group, predominantly of women investigators, but not exclusively, who are trying to understand what happens to people who, to women in particular, who serve in a war zone. Yes, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, so, I mean, this is just so much that you're responsible for.
Yeah.
So a bit overwhelming. What is your staffing like?
Well,
in terms of numbers and in terms of, I mean,
yeah.
how many people do you have working for you that are working on these, these topics?
VA Boston has more than 4,000 employees, I think, at the last count that I was aware of. And of those 4,000 employees, about 1,200 of them are actively involved in research.
Wow.
There are about 250 or 300 principal investigators, which is the term that Dr. Gaziano used. Principal investigators really drive the research. And they can have staff of several hundred, as in the case of Dr. Gaziano's Million Veteran Program, or there could be a small number of people, 2, 3, 4 people who work in a particular area of interest and importance to us.
So you mentioned the post-deployment health problems,
Yeah.
and in particular you mentioned women.
Yeah.
So what sort of issues are you seeing that are unique to women that you're conducting research on?
Well, of course, over the past 40 years, we've learned that women have very special needs following service in the military, and especially service in the military in war zones. And the exposure to war itself, of course, is a particularly dramatic, has a dramatic effect on people. But women, I think in particular, also carry with them being, if you will, a minority group in a much larger male-dominated environment. So that in Vietnam, for example, less than 1% of the people who served, Americans who served there, were women. But today that number is somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 14%, women. So we have this very large group of women, but they still remain a minority and subjected to, all of the things that you can imagine, sort of insulting words or terms or harassment by others, that actually contribute, I think, to some of the stressors that they experienced in the war zone. So they have basically everything that men are exposed to in a war zone, which I think is then punctuated by some of the unique aspects of being a woman in a very male-dominated workplace.
And are the post-deployment health issues, are they different for veterans of different conflicts?
Well, they are in a sense, but we characterize a lot of the problems that people experience in sort of the post-traumatic stress disorder term. This is a condition that has really dated back to the Trojan Wars in terms of the writings about it, but was more officially documented as a psychiatric condition, a psychological disorder, in 1980. Since that time, there's been a tremendous amount of work done in the last 35 years to try to understand how to evaluate this condition and how to also treat it. And there's been such great progress that we now have Institute of Medicine guidelines suggesting what the best practices are for treating people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet it's only one of a very broad range of post-deployment problems. Likely everyone's heard of these improvised explosive devices, or the IEDs. These blasts are causing injuries to the brain and to other parts of the body, actually, but to the brain in particular, that we think of as, concussive-like symptoms. How does traumatic brain injury, TBI, interface with post-traumatic stress? You have this structural, functional part of the brain with the emotional part of the brain being challenged by these stressors in the war zone. How do they relate to one another? How do we decide what kinds of problems are attributable to the structural or the functional parts of the brain, and how do we assign responsibility to the understandable emotional parts of being in a terrible situation? That's a focus of a very large focus of VA Boston healthcare system.
And certainly post-traumatic stress syndrome, it's terminology that I think probably most of our viewers have heard and they're familiar with. Regrettably, when we hear it used in the news, it's usually associated with a major tragedy. And you mentioned a traumatic brain injury. And this, two topics very closely related, and this being really a major focus of the work happening at the VA in Boston. Without getting too technical, but what can you tell us about the current status of the research, and what does that mean for our veterans and our active duty military?
Well, Diane, first I want to say that the overwhelming majority, the vast majority of people with PTSD do not engage in violence. It's very easy in the media to sort of associate a condition with a particular violent episode, whatever, but the data really don't substantiate that. That being said, people with PTSD have a range of problems that are interpersonal. They are personal level. They are emotional. They have difficulties with families, with spouses, with friends, on the job, etc. And all of these issues, all of these problems really are the target of our interest in trying to develop new treatments. But at the heart of it, right now, we are using some of the newest technologies, and Dr. Gaziano will talk about this to some extent as well. We are trying to understand the genetic underpinnings. For example, the big question in all of mental health work is, why do some people in a war zone develop these problems, even if it's a significant minority, maybe 15–20% develop these problems, where on the other hand, 75 to 85% do not develop these problems? Well, the answers may lie in genetic analyses. Some people are predisposed. They may also lie in people's backgrounds, their histories, their family, their development. And this kind of work is currently ongoing. And at the same time, we're trying to use the newest imaging, neuroimaging technology available to understand how is the brain changed. And all of this work is leading to, we think, in the near term and in the midterm, to new treatments to help us understand better what's happened to these people who have served and developed this condition and what we might do to improve their lives and help them readjust in important ways.
It's very exciting.
It's an incredibly exciting time to be working in VA. Very exciting
Absolutely.
time. Yeah.
So, Dr. Gaziano, it's your turn. So, principal investigator, is that what?
Yes, principal investigator.
Okay, for the Million Veteran Program?
Yes, ma'am.
What is the Million Veteran Program?
Well, it's one of the VA's major research initiatives nationally, and it fits into this family of studies that the VA is involved in. I want to just talk very briefly about the range of research that we do in the VA. One of the core things that we do is understanding those particular things that Dr. Turnus and Dr. Keene have talked about that are particular to the veteran population. But we have a very large, the largest healthcare plan in the country with very dedicated veterans and committed veterans. So we study any and every disease that affects them as they age in our system. And the larger program that the Million Veteran Program is nested in is one called the Cooperative Studies Program, where we for 50 years have been trying to understand how to improve treatments for veterans in every disease. One of the first trials where we give a pill and a placebo to a patient was done in the VA in the 1940s. One of the very first blood pressure trials was done as part of this program in the 1960s. One of the very first trials that proved that bypass surgery was good, not just for veterans, but for everyone, took place in the VA setting. So this program's been in existence for about 50 years. Now, I serve as the scientific director of one of the larger centers that does this kind of research that we call Maverick. We do some of these trials, and then we do these large studies like the Million Veteran Program. Now, the Million Veteran Program takes advantage of some very new technologies. One is being to read our genetics, to analyze the genome. Another is these massive computing systems that allow us to use that information. And the third revolution that we're involved in is and the VA has been a leader in this, is putting health records in an electronic format. Now, what does that allow us to do? Well, it allows us to use that data over a long period of time to understand and to divide people into individual groups, people who get prostate cancer, people who live with it, people who don't get it at all. And what we're doing with the Million Veteran Program is we are recruiting 1 million+ individuals, we call them partners in the program, to contribute to us some of their health information. We have them fill out questionnaires about how much they smoke and exercise and diet, and we do some of the surveys that Dr. Keene and his group have developed in PTSD and depression. And then we combine that with the data from their health record, and they provide us with a blood specimen, and this blood specimen flies from 50 locations via overnight mail to our laboratory here in Boston. It's a space-age laboratory that gets processed and put in a robotics freezer, and then we take a little tiny sample of that blood specimen that they send, and we take out the genetic material, the DNA, and we send it out for analysis. And then at the very end of the day, we put all that information together, and the idea is to be able to make a resource available to investigators so we can better understand how genes, in combination with what we do with those genes, the environment, affect health and disease on a scale that's as big as anything that's been done in the United States.
That is huge, and you just said so much. I'm trying to process how I'm going to break that down. So I mean, you started by saying that the VA has been doing these major research efforts for a very long time, and some very incredible breakthroughs have come from work done at the VA, which people might not have known that that's where those breakthroughs came from. So not just our veterans are benefiting from the research that's done. And now, has there ever been a study that involved 1 million veterans, or is this sort of the largest?
So this is the largest study of its kind in the United States.
Okay.
There are a couple of similar type studies around the world. There's one in China and one in the UK that are about 500,000 people each. Okay. But at 350,000, that's how many enrollees we have now. We should, by sometime in August, we're projecting that we'll hit about 400,000. It's the largest cohort of individuals with this high quality data that's ever been assembled in the United States.
So when did this program start?
We started about 5 years ago,
Okay.
and we've been recruiting for about 4 years now. We launched on a very small scale with just a handful of sites, Boston and being one of them, and one of our partners in this is a group down in West Haven. At the West Haven VA, we started with those first 2 sites.
Okay. So this is a nationwide program, obviously, but it's run out of Boston. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, it's run out of Boston in collaboration. It's a massive effort, and there's probably about 500 people throughout the country directly involved in this activity. And coordinating activities take place here in Boston at the West Haven VA. We have auditing that happens at Albuquerque. We have central coordination down in Washington. We have people doing data cleaning from the health record out in Salt Lake City. So it's a massive operation. And then we have 50 sites that are open, 50 VAs that are open for recruitment.
So those 50 sites, how many of those 50 sites are here in the greater Boston area or Massachusetts area?
So we are right now located at the VA Boston, and we've been to all 3 of our campuses. And then we also have activity at White River Junction, Togus, Manchester, and Northampton VAs.
Okay. So in terms of the million, and you suggested that that number could be more than 1 million, but you're at 350,000 now. Is there sort of some breakdown of veterans that you're looking at? You want a certain number of women, you want a certain number of veterans from more recent conflicts, you want a certain number of veterans from the Vietnam War. Is there any sort of breakdown like that, or is it first come, first serve, we're going to take the first 1 million we can get?
Well, we take all comers, and the only requirement is that you have to be a veteran who uses the VA system. So, and then you're eligible. Now, we tend to get the veterans in proportion to their numbers as veteran users, although we are making special outreaches to women and to the younger veterans who tend to be a little bit busier with their work. And because this involves coming in for a visit, we tend to get a larger number of our biggest population, which is the Vietnam era veterans. But what's very nice about the VA is that the veteran uses the VA not only for their health care, there's a real commitment to it. They are volunteers, it's part of their community, and they are very committed to doing research. And what we've heard countless times from our veterans is that they're doing this to help their brethren. And the commitment is across the board. Nowhere else in the country can you get African Americans to sign up at the same rate that we get in the VA. In the VA, we have about 16% of our population is African American, and that's exactly what we have in the Million Veteran Program.
So very, very interesting. Now, in terms of, you mentioned some, targeted outreach to bring in folks who, might otherwise not just pick up the phone and call you and say, how can I participate in this program? But, beyond that, I mean, how are you going to get the 1 million people? Or if somebody comes in for treatment, are they likely to be asked or given some paperwork or, a fact sheet about the program? How do you
So
get your people?
Let me tell you about our main strategies, and it's more than one strategy. So the way we start is we begin by mailing an introductory letter out to any veteran who uses the system. Now, we try to mail it out to them close to the time that they would be coming in for a visit anyway. And we send them a questionnaire. If they send us the questionnaire back that indicating that they really are interested in being part of this, then we send them an appointment letter that we try to time with one of their other appointments just to make it more convenient for them. And then they come in, fill out a consent form with a very brief discussion to let them know about how we're going to be using their data. And we have them sign some paperwork to allow us to access their data. And they provide us with a blood specimen. And then we send them another longer questionnaire about diet, exercise, depression, their military service. That's the main core way that we have people coming in. But in all of our sites, we just hang a banner and say, come one, come all. We're open for business. And some of those are located at high traffic areas, maybe near the blood lab or near the pharmacy or in various clinics. And it points them to either the MVP office there. So those we call our walk-ins. And you can walk in and we'll give you the questionnaires there and we'll sign you up right then and there.
So you've got sort of a very short questionnaire on the front end and then a longer questionnaire. In terms of the questionnaires, are there people to help the veteran fill them out if they need it? I mean, how long will those take?
So the first one takes about 15 minutes. And the second one about 25 minutes. And you're absolutely right that there's ample help. Anyone who comes into the site can feel free to ask the site staff to assist them in helping to understand the questions. We have a call center at another one of our distributed entities at the VA in Canandaigua. There's a call center, a national call center, and we use the national call center to field all calls from our 800 number. And they'll help answer any and all questions about the study, about recruitment, even answer questions about filling out the form.
Excellent. So now what happens? I mean, it's a simple blood test that the veterans would have to do, give a simple blood sample. And then they become part of this, huge study that we're going to learn so much from. But their specific results, do their doctors get that information back sort of in a timely way before you reach your 1 million veterans and, do all of your analysis? Did they get some sort of a notification as to, what the results of that blood sample were? How does that work?
So where we are with the state of the research right now is we're helping to develop the systems of how healthcare systems can utilize the data. And one of the unique things about the Million Veteran Program is that I don't think you can really do it outside of a health system the way we have. But our focus right now is to get that blood specimen into the laboratory and then to do right now what I would consider more experimental analyses on those. And as soon as the information becomes available, we publish that and make it available to the world. We provide in a newsletter, we provide a yearly newsletter to all of the MVP family. If you're a participant, you're part of the MVP family, and we give them a newsletter to let them know what's going on in terms of the state of the research. But a lot of what we're doing is on the cutting edge and is experimental, and it's not designed to provide clinical information to the participant.
Okay.
So if we have findings that we think are important, the nice thing about doing this kind of research in the VA is we can walk across the hall to the clinical side of the house and say, we have something that we think would be useful to our veterans. Then it's up to people in Washington and the likes of Dr. Tarnas to decide whether or not it's something that should be implemented and available to all of our veterans. And beyond that, we have the capacity to help support the clinical system in setting up a program to do genetic testing on a routine basis.
So this sounds a little bit similar to the precision medicine initiative that has been announced by the president recently to look at sort of genetics. I mean, Does your study complement that study? Is there any relationship?
There is a close relationship, and we've been involved in those discussions with the White House. In fact, Jennifer Dean, one of our program coordinators, was at the White House when the president made his announcement a couple of weeks ago. Oh. And then there were several of us that were at the NIH symposium to help design the coordinated effort by the NIH. So we are playing a very active role in helping to build this type of initiative. I will say that the Million Veteran Program epitomizes many of the things that the president wants to see in this national initiative.
So if there is a veteran watching that wants to be one of the million and they have not yet sort of been touched by your outreach or not yet been asked when they have visited their facility, what should they do?
So the first thing is that at any of those sites that I mentioned, there are coordinators that are willing to take a walk-in if you happen to be there. Most of the information centers at those 5 VAs that I mentioned have brochures, and so if you're on the campus, you can inquire, and hopefully the information people will be able to direct you. If they can't, I want to hear about that. The second thing that you can do is go to the website, which is www.research.va.gov/MVP for the Million Veteran Program. And there is information on the website, and we list all the sites in the country of where we are. And we will be migrating the sites. We'll be closing some and opening others so that eventually we find our way around the country. And there's also an 800 number that they can call. They'll get that call center in Canandaigua. They can give them information about how they can enroll.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Keene, I'm going to come back to you.
Sure.
I mean, you touched on several important areas of research, but could we just provide our viewers with an update on the status of the research related to post-traumatic stress syndrome?
Well, sure, but it's not easy to sort of boil it down to...
Into 2 minutes? Come on.
It is a very vast and growing area of interest, scientifically and clinically. I will say a couple of things that I think are remarkable highlights. One is that in the mid-1980s, we examined a cohort of people who had served in Vietnam. And it was from that study, called the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study, that we learned that the prevalence rate of PTSD 15, 20 years after the war was approximately 15% of the 3 million people who served in Vietnam. More recently, we've actually gone back out into the field to examine these same veterans, whether they were in Vietnam or a comparison group of people who were in the military but didn't go to Vietnam. And what we found was that the prevalence rate of PTSD had actually declined. It's now, instead of 15%, it's down to about 11% in the general population of Vietnam theater veterans. This is an amazing study that the VA has conducted. One, it's really the first sort of nationwide epidemiological study in mental health that had ever been conducted. Veterans or non-veterans. It was really the first. But most importantly, we were able to examine what happened to these people over the next 25 years. Wow. And that really represents some very encouraging news. With these sort of reductions in prevalence rates of PTSD, I think the investment that this country made in evaluation and treating this condition actually has paid off for us. When you think about 4%, you say, well, it's just 4%, but it's really about a 25 or 30% reduction in the number of cases in the country. So those findings have not actually yet been published in scientific journals, and but have been presented nationally in various conferences. And this is very important because it sort of substantiates the investment. I think another set of findings that I think are important to highlight for the community is the information that we have on OEF, OIF veterans. These are Iraq and Afghanistan veterans.
And just tell folks, many our veterans certainly know what OEF and OIF means, but that's Operation
Enduring
Freedom
Freedom.
and Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Iraqi freedom,
Okay.
exactly. People who served in those war zones. What we learned was that the amount of combat that these people have seen over the course of these 13 plus years is very substantial. These are high conflict zones, and people are serving multiple tours of duty. And this actually represents, in my mind, an issue of great public health concern, because it's not just the veterans who are suffering, it's their spouses, it's their children, it's their parents, their siblings, et cetera. So it's, although there are only, if you will, 2.7 million people who've served, the actual ripple effects, the direct ripple effects actually probably constitute something in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 million Americans who are pretty directly affected. And what we've learned is that the men and the women are exposed to the same levels of combat. This is a big surprise. This is very different from Vietnam, where the women who served, the 1% or fewer served, were actually in either healthcare jobs or administrative jobs. Today, they're actually carrying weapons. They are flying choppers. They are going into hot landing zones. They are doing virtually everything that the men are doing. And they're suffering at the same rates. So that 10 or 15 years ago, I was asked by the House Veterans Affairs leader, should women go into combat, Dr. Keene, from the vantage point of the emotional consequences? And I said, well, we don't really know, but military war zone service has always given people a leg up in this country. Today, the answer would be different. The answer would be men and women appear to be able to do exactly the same things, or very close to the same things in war zones, but they also suffer at the same rates. And the important point here, again, for the audience, is that it is a relatively modest minority of people, probably somewhere between 15 and 30%, who are suffering either from post-traumatic stress disorder or from the effects of these mild traumatic brain injuries. And we're working very hard, especially in Boston, but elsewhere in the country, working very hard to understand what's attributable to the emotional aspects of the war zone and what's attributable to these head injuries or these brain injuries. And we're hoping to have answers in the relatively near term.
And just, I'm in awe of sort of the work that you are doing. You mentioned a very important point, that the post-traumatic stress syndrome, it doesn't just affect the veteran.
No.
It affects the people that they love, the people that they work with. Does your research ever sort of go out and touch people beyond the veteran?
Sure, yeah. We are always very aware that people don't sort of live alone and operate as an individual unit. The units are families and spouses and children and the like, and employers, et cetera. And so we do try to understand how people are interfacing with their communities. And I think it also is, in so many ways, from my vantage point, the communities have a responsibility back to the people who've served. And I'll just highlight the issue of jobs and the issues of home and the issues of support in the communities. Memorials are very powerful. For us, they may be just architecturally magnificent things to look at. But the deep meaning for people who've served in these war zones just can't be underestimated. I think it's really, can't be overestimated. I think it's really important for the communities to come together as we can to provide the necessary support for the individual, but also for their families.
Of course.
To help them forward.
Diane, if I could add that one of our first test projects in the Million Veteran Program is studying PTSD.
Yeah.
We have now 200,000 people who have had their specimens sent out for genetic analysis. And we have tens of thousands of people in that group that have PTSD.
Wow.
And we have people from all eras. And so it will give us the opportunity with those kinds of numbers to see if we can decipher some of the genetics behind the disorder, number one, and perhaps there are different flavors. If we've got the expert right here, but perhaps there are different flavors from the different conflicts. I think one of the things that I've been struck by in dealing with some of the experts that are helping us with this PTSD project, and they're from throughout the country, as well as our local expertise here, is the nature of the conflicts were so different. I mean, in the old days, there was a front line, and you were under combat stress when you were there. But if you went back on leave, that was a safe place. It's very, very different with the current conflicts, where you almost never feel that with the IEDs that Dr. Keene was talking about, it's almost for your entire deployment on a constant state of
very different.
A very different kind of conflict.
Wow.
So we'll be able to potentially see, since we have people from the Vietnam era and the Gulf War era and the OEF, OIF era, we'll be able to look separately, given the large numbers that we have, and see if there are potential differences.
And the culture of the service is different across these war zones.
Absolutely.
The reactions of the communities receiving the returning veterans was different.
Very different.
It becomes a very complicated matter. But Dr. Gaziano's program of research gives us the opportunity to look at all of these variables in ways that may give us the real clue as to what the underpinnings are. Why do some people develop PTSD and others with the same exact combat exposure do not? These are really intriguing questions, and this data set is really the door that's going to help us understand.
We need this information as soon as possible. So now, earlier you said, I think the Million Veteran Program has been happening for 5 years, and you're maybe a third of the way there in terms of the number of veterans who are already into the system. When did you say that you thought you would reach the million mark?
Well, we are attempting to accelerate our recruitment, and we are beginning to move beyond the site-based strategies. This spring, we will be piloting ways to recruit people that are different than the traditional coordinator. So we're going to be piloting consent by mail, by phone, and perhaps by the web. If we can deal with the security issues. One of the key things that we have to assure our veterans is that we will protect their data. And that's why we're building a very large computing environment where the data will stay only in that environment, something that's very different than other research programs. In projects that I've been involved in at Harvard, at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, like the Physician's Health Study and the Nurses' Health Study, traditionally what we would do is we would give an investigator a data set, and they would take it to their laboratory, put it on their computers, and analyze that data. Now, we made them, provide us with the assurances that their systems were secure. Right. It's our intention not to do that anymore. Our intention is to have a very large environment where investigators would come, and we would create a little sandbox where they could do their research, but it never leaves the computing environment. So as long as we can maintain those kinds of secure environments, we can potentially do other creative things. So our hope is, to get back to your original question, is to be able to accelerate the recruitment beyond what we're doing now, which is about 110,000 people per year. It's a remarkable number to begin with, but we'd like to see if we can do better.
It is, but it's not fast enough. And so once you reach the million, then what is your best guesstimate of how much time the researchers will need with the data before they start to publish significant results?
So we're already moving in that direction. So we are, we have to walk before we run, but the idea is to do both these things in parallel.
Okay.
So we're going to continue recruitment, and we hope that this will be a resource for decades to come. And if you think about, one of the resources that was created not too far from here, out in Framingham, called the Framingham Heart Study. Okay. It was started in the late 1940s. And for almost 70 years, it has provided us with information about not only what it was started to teach us about, which was heart disease. And we learned that cholesterol and smoking and high blood pressure and age and gender and all these things contribute to heart disease. Well, that study has now contributed in terms of depression and Alzheimer's disease and cancer. And we're building the same kind of resource that we would hope decades from now, we'll look back and say, wow, this resource has been used for quite some time. In the process of creating the resource, we are beginning to figure out how to make it available to investigators.
Excellent.
I do want to just highlight one of the things that is at the heart of the program is the amazing electronic medical record that VA has been working on for some 35 or 40 years. And it really does allow information to be gleaned from the real clinical diagnoses that patients are receiving in conjunction with the genetic information, in conjunction with these questionnaires, all of which provide different vectors, if you will, of information that the researchers can analyze. And this makes it also a very unique
Very
set
significant.
of data. Very important.
Very
And makes it
significant.
possible. I mean, you can't imagine. Framingham was 5,000 people, and they would study them every few years. They would come in, and then they would go get their health records. Well, we couldn't do that for
That's right.
300,000
That's right.
people.
Right.
And the VA is truly one of the few health systems in the country that has the expanse of data going back in time and going forward in time that will allow us to do this at the highest level.
Tremendous capacity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Consider
Yes.
the VA really moved to a fully electronic medical record in the late 90s, in the last century. That means that we have all of those years with all of the health events documented electronically in a more or less searchable way to draw upon for any study that VA does. And the genetic study that MVP is undertaking is just one example, but I think one of the enormous strengths of VA research is the power of large numbers, that there are databases that can, in an hour or 2 hours, yield information about 100,000 gallbladder removals or 200,000 heart surgeries, to enable investigators to ask questions that really couldn't be answered in small studies. And yet they can go into the databases, they can extract the data, and they can understand really important aspects of healthcare that really could not be done anywhere else, because VA has had this commitment for so many years to a fully electronic medical record and has found ways to make the data organized and available to researchers to improve the care that we provide.
It really is a remarkable system. Having worked for the National Archives for 37 years, I'm actually a little bit familiar, and it's an unparalleled system. I mean, and others are learning so much from this system. It really is, it's quite incredible.
And if you combine that with the other key ingredient, which is the willingness of our veterans who are in our system for, since the VA is not just healthcare, it's really part of a community for many of our veterans. They stay with the system for a long period of time. So outside the VA, if you try to do this in another health system, they might be with that health system for
Right.
a couple of years, and then they move to the next. And the veterans are extremely willing to allow us to use this, knowing the value that it could bring to the whole
So
system.
important.
I think this is one of the
That's it.
remarkable things. I've been in the VA since 1977, and the same sort of spirit for participation that Dr. Gaziano has described existed back in 1977. And it really accounts for why VA has had such a remarkable impact for a relatively small system. Even though nationwide, it's a relatively small system. It's had a major impact in scientific discoveries. And I think it's in part due to people's willingness, the veterans' willingness to participate and to come back in again. We have one study called the Normative Aging Study that began in the early 1960s. And these people come back annually or
Wow.
every other year for an examination. This is amazing.
Because they
to all of
understand the
us.
significance. They understand what they're contributing.
And they understand what they're
Wow.
contributing, but it's also for the other brethren.
Right. Yeah,
That's really
Wow.
powerful.
Right.
This is a population that served.
Yeah.
They were service-oriented when they began their military service. And I think that as a group, they've maintained that commitment to service. So when Dr. Gaziano says, you know, I'm not doing this for myself, I'm doing it for my buddies,
Absolutely.
they really mean it. We
Absolutely.
have incredibly high rates of enrollment in clinical studies in VA because we have this incredibly committed population
Very
of
good
veterans.
news.
Yeah, it is.
Very, very
It
good
is.
news. You know, in preparation for our conversation today, I was, reading a little bit. And Dr. Keene, I read that one of your researchers identified chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Yes.
And that's rather significant. And, we're running short on time, but can you highlight that? I mean, it's major.
Well, very quickly, Dr. Ann McKee, who is a neuropathologist who works at VA Boston and Boston University, identified that a problem that had been observed maybe as long ago as 100 years may actually be a defect in tau, a protein that occurs naturally in the brain. And this tauopathy, a pathology of tau protein, appears to have been stimulated by blows to the head, whether it's from boxing or hockey or from football. But apropos of the VA's needs, VA became very interested in this because of the blast injuries and the traumatic brain injuries that the veterans in these war zones in particular have been exposed to. Always in all wars, these things have happened. But we are now working very hard to see if, in fact, we can identify who has developed this tau defect, and which would then help us to understand what might be done to intervene for people early on in the process so that it doesn't cascade downhill to lead to the dementias that we've seen, for example, in the hockey players and the football players in these last few years. So Dr. Ann McKee's work is very important, and we have aggregated a large number of investigators who are working with her. And more recently, Senator Leahy of Vermont actually gave the National Center for PTSD additional resources to develop a brain bank for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we are just now getting that particular program off the ground, again at VA Boston. And we will be looking to understand what has happened to people's brains, people who have been diagnosed with PTSD, people who have had traumatic brain injuries, and people who have not. So we have a very large program of research going to focus on this issue of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's very exciting also.
Very excited. So we really are at the end of our time, but Dr. Chun, any just last thoughts for our viewers? Anything that you want to share?
Well, I think everything that we've talked about really is a reflection of the uniqueness of VA as a healthcare system. In these days, we talk about attempts in the private sector to set up accountable care organizations where instead of having fee-for-service, population health will be attended to by giving what they call a value-based payment system. You get a budget, you take care of a population. In VA, our population belongs to us for life. They are under our care for life. VA has had to develop systems to be able to keep track of patients over a lifetime. But because we get a fixed budget to care for those patients, we're invested in keeping them healthy over a lifetime. So we've developed barcodes for administering medications and electronic medical records for keeping track of them. Everything that VA has been able to do in research is in many ways a parallel reflection of what VA has set up as an integrated healthcare system. 8 or 9 million people under care at any one time, but many more cared for over the years who we can keep track of. And because VA is committed to not only clinical care, but education and research, we have a responsibility to be able to understand not only how to improve the care that we provide veterans through research, but also how to educate the next generation.
Yeah. Good words to end on. I wish we had more time. Perhaps we can get you back. I think we've shared a tremendous amount of information. I want to thank our guests from the VA Boston Healthcare System for joining us today and for helping us to better understand the important research that is being done to support our veterans. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you will continue to join us as we feature other federal agencies on your federal government.